Welcome to Sleepy Crime, where the city grows quiet, the lights fade, and the most unsettling stories unfold slowly, without spectacle. Tonight, we travel to San Francisco in the mid-1970s, a city shaped by fog, neon reflections, and streets that emptied late at night. A city known for freedom and self-expression, but also for fear that lingered quietly, often unspoken. Men began to be attacked after brief encounters. The victims were approached calmly, engaged in conversation, asked simple questions. Some survived, some did not. The attacks followed no loud pattern, only a soft repetition that unsettled a community already accustomed to being watched carefully and judged harshly. Police collected sketches of the suspect, a man who carried a pen and paper, drawing quietly before violence followed. The media called him the Doodler, but what made this case especially dangerous was not his method. It was the silence surrounding it. Survivors were afraid to testify. Witnesses hesitated. Names went unspoken. This is not a story about mystery or legend. It is a story about fear, trust, and what happens when justice depends on voices that cannot safely speak. So settle in. Let the city dim to background noise. And join us as we begin the quiet, unsettling story of the Doodler Murders, fear and silence in San Francisco. In the mid-1970s, San Francisco occupied a strange and delicate moment in its history. The city was celebrated worldwide as a place of freedom, experimentation, and self-expression, a symbol of cultural transformation that had accelerated throughout the previous decade. But alongside that reputation existed a quieter reality, one shaped by caution, coded behavior, and unspoken rules of survival. San Francisco at dusk was not the postcard version of the city. It was a place where boundaries sharpened as daylight faded, and where visibility could turn dangerous depending on who you were and where you stood. As evening settled in, neighborhoods changed character subtly rather than dramatically. Streets that bustled during the day grew quieter without fully emptying. Neon signs flickered to life, casting reflections on damp pavement left by coastal fog. The sound of traffic softened, replaced by scattered conversations, distant music, and the hum of bars preparing for another night. From a distance, it all felt welcoming. From within certain communities, it felt guarded. For gay men in 1970s San Francisco, the city promised refuge, but that promise was conditional. The legal and social landscape remained deeply conservative despite surface-level progress. Sexual activity between men had only recently been decriminalized in California, and discrimination remained institutionalized and often violent. Police harassment, public shaming, job loss, and family rejection were ongoing realities. Acceptance was uneven, fragile, and dependent on silence. Nightlife offered a kind of sanctuary, but it was one defined by caution. Bars, clubs, and late-night diners served as gathering points where connections could be made without names exchanged too quickly. Privacy was a form of currency. Many men lived dual lives, carefully separating public respectability from private truth. Trust was extended slowly, selectively. A wrong assumption could cost employment, housing, or safety. This environment shaped how people interacted with strangers. Conversations were often brief, exploratory, coded. Questions were asked obliquely. Intentions were inferred rather than declared. In these exchanges, ambiguity provided protection. It also created vulnerability. Against this backdrop, the city itself acted as participant rather than stage. San Francisco's geography encouraged movement. Long walks through neighborhoods, encounters in bars followed by shared routes into quieter streets, temporary connections formed and dissolved within the same night. The fog softened edges and reduced visibility, blurring faces at a distance. Streetlights illuminated pockets, rather than expanses. The city did not feel washed. It felt permissive. Policing practices of the era further complicated this sense of safety. Relations between law enforcement and the gay community were tense and distrustful. Raids on bars were still within living memory. Reporting assaults risked exposure, retaliation, or ridicule. Victims had to weigh the trauma of being attacked against the consequences of making their identity official through police contact. Silence often felt safer than justice. It was in this fragile space, between liberation and fear, openness and restraint, that a series of violent attacks began quietly unfolding. At first, they did not appear connected. They were not immediately fatal in every instance. Some victims survived and vanished from public attention. Others were found dead with little context that could survive scrutiny. The city absorbed these events as separate tragedies rather than signals of a pattern. The importance of this context cannot be overstated. These crimes did not happen in a vacuum. They occurred in a community that had been trained, both culturally and institutionally, not to speak freely. The conditions that allowed the attacks to continue were not created by one individual alone. They were reinforced by fear that preceded him and silence that followed each incident. At dusk, the city transitioned into ambiguity. The public facade receded. Private worlds expanded carefully. Men walked streets with practiced awareness, gauging safety through subtle cues, body language, tone, familiarity. Trust was rarely immediate, but when it came, it was often provisional, extended for the duration of a conversation or a shared block of sidewalk. The expectation was not permanence, but mutual discretion. This environment created opportunities for someone patient, observant, and calm. A person who did not arouse suspicion through urgency or force, who blended into the city's rhythms rather than disrupted them. Someone who understood that drawing attention was not necessary when silence already prevailed. The attacks that followed would later be grouped under a single name, but at the time they entered the city's memory as isolated shocks. A stabbing here, an assault there. A sketch circulated quietly. The victims, when known, were discussed softly, often without names. Rumors circulated within certain circles, but they rarely broke into broader awareness. Fear moved faster than information. San Francisco's reputation as a haven complicated the narrative further. Acknowledging violence within the community risked reinforcing stereotypes and inviting outside scrutiny. Silence, again, felt protective, but protection has limits. When danger persists, silence begins to function as concealment, not only of identity, but of threat. The earliest attacks did not announce themselves as the beginning of a series. They arrived quietly, irregularly, absorbed by a city already accustomed to violence that rarely made noise beyond the immediate circle it affected. In police logs, they appeared as disconnected stabbings, assaults that did not immediately suggest continuity. Some victims survived long enough to provide partial accounts. Others did not. And in each case, the context surrounding the victim shaped how the event was interpreted, and how quickly it faded from sustained attention. What unified these early incidents was not geography alone, nor timing, nor even method at first glance. What connected them was conversation. Victims reported being approached calmly, often inside bars or near places where late-night social interactions were routine. The attacker did not appear rushed. He spoke easily, asked questions, listened. There was no overt threat in those initial moments. To many victims, he appeared curious rather than dangerous, another man navigating the same coded environment. Several survivors would later recall a detail that initially seemed trivial. The man sometimes carried paper, a small notebook or loose sheets, and a pen. In casual conversation, He would begin sketching, drawing faces, sometimes caricatures, sometimes abstract figures. This behavior felt unusual but not alarming. Artists were not rare in San Francisco. Drawing suggested creativity, sensitivity, intelligence. In a city that prided itself on self-expression, it felt almost reassuring. It was only later, after violence followed these encounters, that this detail acquired weight. When police began collecting statements, they noticed repetition in these descriptions. Survivors, hesitant and guarded, often shared certain elements independently. The man was described as black, well-spoken, neatly dressed. He did not fit stereotypes of visible menace. His demeanor combined confidence with restraint. To victims accustomed to scanning for danger, he did not register as a threat until it was too late. This calmness proved crucial. Violence did not erupt immediately. It followed movement, walking together, leaving a public setting for a quieter space, turning down a side street. The transition from conversation to attack happened quickly and decisively, without escalation or warning. In surviving accounts, there was rarely time to process what was happening before it was already over. When police attempted to categorize the incidents, obstacles emerged immediately. Witnesses were sparse. Scenes offered little usable evidence. Many victims had been attacked in private or semi-private spaces where no bystanders were present. And even when descriptions existed, they were often inconsistent in surface details, height, hairstyle, clothing color, reflecting the difficulty of memory retracing trauma rather than deceit. Yet one element persisted: drawing. The first composite sketch emerged from this repetition. Artists worked with survivors to render the face they had seen briefly, often under stress, often at night. Composite sketches are imperfect tools. They rely on memory filtered through fear and degradation. But even imperfection can reveal pattern. When early sketches were compared, similarities suggested a single individual rather than coincidence. This marked a shift in the investigation. What had been treated as isolated attacks now began to cohere into something structured. The media took notice cautiously. Coverage was restrained in part because of the victims' identities, and in part because police themselves were reluctant to amplify fear without certainty. The nickname affixed to the suspect, the Doodler, emerged from this moment, shaped by shorthand rather than sensational intent. Yet naming carries consequences. A nickname simplifies complexity and attracts attention unevenly. In this case, it risked framing seriousness as eccentricity. A man who draws does not immediately inspire fear. The label softened perception, even as evidence suggested escalating lethality. Inside the police department, concern grew quietly. Investigators recognized how unusual this approach was. An offender who relied on conversation rather than force, who presented as relatable, who stayed within social norms until the moment of attack. This made him difficult to detect and harder to warn against. How do you caution a community against someone whose behavior mirrors harmless interaction? Public warnings, when issued, were vague. Advisories urged caution when leaving bars late at night, recommended walking with friends, encouraged reporting suspicious behavior. None could address the underlying reality. Trust itself had been weaponized. And trust in this environment was already fragile. Survivors faced agonizing decisions. Assisting the investigation required exposure, acknowledging sexuality publicly, cooperating with law enforcement, enduring media scrutiny. For many, the price felt too high. Some gave partial statements anonymously. Others declined follow-up interviews. A few refused entirely. Each withdrawal was understandable. Each eroded the investigation incrementally. Police understood this even as frustration mounted. Cooperation cannot be coerced ethically. Trauma complicates memory and willingness. Investigators were forced to build a case on fragments rather than full narratives. Patterns emerge slowly, obscured by fear rather than ignorance. The first sketch circulated quietly within law enforcement within certain communities, but it did not trigger recognition widespread enough to halt the attacks. This was not due to incompetence. It was due to constraints imposed by time, stigma, and self-preservation. The image represented possibility, not proof. As months passed, more attacks occurred. Each reinforced what investigators already suspected. The same approach, the same calm entry into victims' lives, the same abrupt violence. The sketch gained refinement, but certainty remained elusive. Witnesses sometimes recognized similarities, but not enough to name someone definitively. As the pattern of attacks slowly emerged, investigators encountered a barrier more formidable than geography or evidence degradation. It was fear, not the sudden kind that follows violence, but the sustained, rational fear rooted in lived experience. This fear did not shout. It withdrew. It narrowed voices and erased witnesses. And in doing so, it became the most effective shield the attacker possessed. For survivors, the choice to speak was never simple. Reporting meant exposure, and exposure in 1970s San Francisco carried consequences far beyond a police statement. Many men who survived these attacks lived lives carefully divided into visible and invisible halves. Employment, family relationships, housing security, and social standing were often dependent on maintaining silence about identity. To speak publicly meant risking everything beyond the trauma already endured. Even when survivors did report assaults, cooperation came haltingly. Interviews were guarded. Details were compartmentalized. Names of bars went unspoken. Routes walked together were blurred, not because survivors wanted to protect the attacker, but because full disclosure felt more dangerous than partial truth. The cost-benefit calculation was brutal and unavoidable. Law enforcement recognized this constraint, but recognition did not remove it. Officers could not promise protection against social consequences. They could not undo reputational harm or family rejection. Nor could they guarantee anonymity once court proceedings began. Witness testimony, by its nature, demands visibility. And for many survivors, visibility had always been the risk to avoid. This dynamic distorted investigation fundamentally. A crime with reluctant witnesses becomes a crime without witnesses in practice. Without testimony, cases weakened. Without strong cases, arrests stalled. And without arrests, fear intensified. Each unresolved attack reinforced the belief that speaking did not lead to safety. Silence became self-perpetuating. Within the gay community, knowledge spread quietly. Stories circulated without names attached. Descriptions were whispered rather than announced. Advice was shared discreetly: avoid walking alone, trust your instincts, do not follow strangers too far. These warnings, however, lacked specificity. They relied on general caution rather than actionable intelligence. And in an environment already governed by caution that offered little defense, the media faced limitations as well. Reporting openly on attacks against gay men risked inviting public backlash or moral judgment. Editors hesitated. Coverage, when it appeared, was often restrained and euphemistic. This restraint reduced public pressure on authorities and diminished awareness beyond the community already affected. The crimes existed within a narrowing circle of concern. Legal context further complicated matters. Sodomy laws, though shifting, remained a weapon of intimidation. Victims feared that reporting an assault could expose them to legal scrutiny unrelated to the crime itself. Even where enforcement was inconsistent, The threat alone sufficed to silence many. Just as systems built without trust cannot function fully when trust is required most, investigators attempted workarounds. They encouraged anonymous tips. They sought corroboration through indirect means, timelines, hospital records, third-party observations. But without first-hand accounts willing to withstand scrutiny, these efforts often stalled. Patterns could be suggested, but not proved. This absence of witnesses had a chilling effect on strategy. The attacker understood this environment, whether consciously or intuitively. His continued freedom depended less on evasion than on probability, the statistical likelihood that silence would persist. And persist it did. Fear also reshaped behavior in subtle ways. Survivors avoided returning to bars. Social circles shrank. Opportunities for connection narrowed. Some then relocated or retreated into isolation. These adaptations reduced exposure to risk but increased vulnerability in other ways, cutting individuals off from support networks and reinforcing invisibility. The emotional toll extended beyond individuals to the broader community. Anxiety became ambient. Trust eroded not just with strangers, but within institutions. The idea that reporting harm could cause further harm strained belief in protection. In this space, fear did not announce itself loudly. It settled into routine. Law enforcement frustration grew alongside sympathy. Officers saw the same dynamic repeat, a surviving victim torn between safety and survival of identity. They understood the stakes even when they could not lower them. The system demanded visibility in exchange for justice. Survivors demanded safety through invisibility. Neither could fully accommodate the other. Segment 3 captures the investigation at an impasse defined not by lack of effort, but by incompatible realities. Fear made witnesses cautious, caution made evidence scarce, and scarcity preserved danger. The crimes continued not because people failed to act, but because action carried unacceptable cost. As the city moved through nights heavy with fog and quiet tension, the sketch circulated without voice, the warnings traveled without authority, and the fear remained without resolution. Violence does not always hide in darkness alone. Sometimes it hides in the silence fear makes necessary, and as long as fear silenced witnesses, the doodler remained free, outlined on paper, but insulated by a system that required exactly what victims could not safely give. By the late 1970s, the most unsettling feature of the Doodler case was no longer the violence itself, but the ease with which it faded. Attacks had occurred. Lives had been disrupted, some ended. A suspect had been described, sketched, and quietly circulated within law enforcement. And yet, despite these elements, the individual responsible appeared to dissolve back into the city without resistance. He did not vanish abruptly. He did not flee in panic. He simply continued existing indistinguishable, unchallenged, and free. This absence of confrontation reshaped the investigation into something almost abstract. Police departments are trained to respond to escalation, to patterns that tighten and sharpen until intervention becomes unavoidable. The Doodler's trajectory resisted a template. Violence did not crescendo publicly. There was no dramatic turning point that demanded visible response. Attacks seemed to slow, then stop. Or perhaps they simply ceased being reported. In either case, resolution never arrived. Investigators were left to wrestle with uncertainty rather than failure. Did the perpetrator leave the city? Did he die? Was he incarcerated for unrelated crimes? Or did fear suppress reporting so effectively that his presence remained undetected? Each possibility was plausible. None could be confirmed. The lack of closure did not mean the crimes were unsolved in the typical sense. It meant the story itself had ended quietly, without acknowledgement. This quiet ending proved especially damaging because it allowed the attacker's anonymity to solidify. When crime stops suddenly, public attention diminishes. Without pressure, resources shift elsewhere. Warnings lose urgency. New generations remain unaware of danger that once existed. The doodler did not escape through cunning alone. He escaped through the natural decay of memory. The circumstances that enabled his disappearance were structural, not accidental. The investigation reached its limits not because police lacked interest, but because systems of testimony and prosecution could not operate without willing witnesses. Cases without cooperative victims rarely reach trial, and trials without testimony rarely succeed. Law enforcement understood the identity of the suspect mattered less than the likelihood of conviction. Without witnesses willing to testify publicly, arrest risked collapse. There was also the uncomfortable possibility that a name was known privately, that law enforcement, constrained by legal and ethical limits, could not act upon suspicion alone. In an era before modern DNA databases and surveillance infrastructure, proof depended on human voice more than physical trace. And voice remained fragile. The city itself absorbed this outcome with quiet resignation. In public discourse, the case receded gently. It did not generate widespread outrage comparable to other serial crimes because its victims existed within a community already accustomed to being marginalized. This is not to say the city was indifferent, but attention did not sustain long-term intensity. The absence of formal resolution allowed collective memory to soften. For survivors, this outcome delivered a different kind of harm. Many had stepped forward anonymously, trusting that shared information might eventually prevent further attacks. When nothing followed, no arrest, no trial, no acknowledgement, the effort felt futile. The cost of speaking, however partial, had not yielded protection. This reinforced the logic of silence rather than dismantling it. Meanwhile, the suspect remained a presence defined entirely by absence. He had been rendered as a sketch, but never anchored to a name publicly. He existed in files and quiet discussions, but not in record. His freedom did not depend on innocence, only on the absence of testimony strong enough to restrict him. In this way, he benefited from the same silence he helped cultivate. This dynamic raises difficult questions about accountability and justice. Is a crime resolved because it stops? Or does resolution require acknowledgement, responsibility, and consequence? The Doodler case resists comforting answers. Violence that ends without reckoning leaves no lessons enforced, only warnings ignored. Segment 4 closes on this unresolved departure. A killer who did not run, did not hide dramatically, did not face trial or punishment. A man who walked away not because the system failed completely, but because it functioned within limits that silence defined. His legacy is not one of notoriety, but invisibility, the most effective escape route of all. As San Francisco continued to change, to modernize, to rebrand itself as a symbol of progress, the story of the Doodler murmured quietly beneath the surface. Not as myth, not as legend, but as a reminder that justice requires voices willing to be heard, and that when speaking is dangerous, truth may never anchor itself fully to law. When the violence stopped, it did not feel like relief. It felt like uncertainty stretching out in slow motion. Investigators waited for another incident that never came, uncertain whether silence meant safety or concealment. In criminal investigations, long gaps often invite hope, but in this case they produced only ambiguity. Without confirmation of the perpetrator's absence, the case could not meaningfully close. It simply slowed, congealed, and settled into a stretched moment of unresolved tension. The files remained active on paper. Reports were cataloged. Sketches stayed archived. Leads were reviewed periodically. Yet active momentum was gone. Investigations depend not only on information, but on pressure, the pressure created by urgency, repetition, and public expectation. As time passed and no new attacks were reported, that pressure dissipated naturally. The machinery of investigation did not fail, it idled. The difficulty lay not in abandonment, but in paralysis. Without new evidence, investigators could not justify aggressive action. Without cooperative witnesses, the legal threshold for arrest could not be met. Without arrest, media attention declined. And without media attention, no new witnesses felt compelled or protected enough to come forward. The system reached equilibrium, stable, silent, and ineffective. This stasis was reinforced by institutional reality. Law enforcement agencies must allocate limited resources. New cases arrive daily. Active threats demand response. Cold cases require commitment, but not at the expense of unfolding danger elsewhere. The Doodler case, frozen without resolution, became one among many. It was not forgotten, but it was deprioritized, a subtle but consequential transition. Inside the department, frustration lingered. Some investigators believed the suspect had been identified, at least privately. Others believed the absence of new reports reflected successful deterrence through quiet warnings. These interpretations coexisted uneasily. No consensus formed. No closure followed. Knowledge remained suggestive rather than actionable. For the community most affected, the frozen state of the case translated into quiet resignation. Bars remained open. Lives continued. Caution persisted, but without clarity. Fear receded into background awareness rather than immediate alarm. The threat became historical instead of present. This shift did not restore trust. It simply managed anxiety. Survivors carried consequences differently. Some chose to remain silent permanently, burying memory alongside unresolved expectation. Others spoke publicly decades later, when cultural conditions changed enough to soften risk. But memory is not evidence. It is shaped by time, trauma, and survival. By then, the case had already hardened into the past. The silence surrounding the Doodler murders did not imply lack of harm. It masked prolonged impact. Lives were altered not only by violence, but by the knowledge that justice had no pathway that did not require self-exposure. The system asked victims to sacrifice safety to pursue accountability. Many declined, not out of apathy, but out of necessity. The case froze not because of mystery, but because of incompatibility. The needs of survivors and the requirements of prosecution could not align. When systems depend on testimony from those most at risk for giving it, silence becomes structurally embedded. Accountability becomes optional rather than assured. This frozen state also influenced how history would remember the case. Without an arrest, the story lost narrative clarity. It offered no resolution to anchor meaning. Instead, it remained fragmented, remembered unevenly, occasionally resurfacing, but never completing. The Doodler was neither infamous nor fully erased. He lingered ambiguously in between. Segment 5 marks this transformation. From active fear to historical quiet. From urgent investigation to static record. From collective concern to specialized memory. Silence did not end the harm. It redistributed it, away from headlines and onto individuals who carried it alone. As years passed, new generations arrived without awareness of what had preceded them. The city evolved. Laws changed. Visibility increased. Yet the frozen case remained unchanged beneath these shifts. It waited without expectation. Silence, once a defense, became permanence. And permanence solidified the truth that justice delayed is not merely justice denied, it is justice that dissolves into something else entirely. something quieter, something heavier. The doodler did not need to be caught to achieve disappearance. Time finished the work that fear began with enough distance. The most unsettling aspect of the doodler investigation is not what investigators did wrong, but what the situation itself prevented them from doing at all. Looking back through the case files with modern perspective reveals no single catastrophic failure, no clear moment where justice slipped through someone's fingers. Instead, it reveals something far more difficult to confront, a case shaped by missed possibilities rather than missed actions, constrained by social realities that left little room for intervention. In hindsight, several warning signs appear painfully clear. Multiple attacks followed a consistent behavioral pattern. Survivors independently described similar directions. A composite sketch was produced and refined. Police believed they were dealing with the same individual. And yet, these indicators failed to coalesce into effective disruption. The reason is not mystery. It is limitation. At the heart of what was missed lies the structure of justice itself. Criminal prosecution in the 1970s was overwhelmingly dependent on eyewitness testimony. Physical evidence played a supporting role rather than a central one. DNA analysis was non-existent. Surveillance infrastructure was minimal. Digital records did not exist. Without cooperative witnesses willing to identify the suspect in court, cases were legally fragile, regardless of investigative belief. Investigators could suspect a perpetrator strongly and still be powerless to act. What was missed, then, was not evidence, but safety. There were no mechanisms capable of protecting survivors from the repercussions of speaking publicly. Confidential testimony had limits. Anonymous cooperation could inform investigation, but not conviction. Witness protection programs were reserved for different scales of crime and different kinds of witnesses. Victims of sexual violence, especially those already marginalized, were expected to carry both truth and risk simultaneously. Law enforcement acknowledged these constraints internally, even as they struggled to compensate. Officers attempted to build cases through circumstantial patterns, seeking corroboration without exposure. But circumstantial cases require accumulation, and accumulation requires patience and repetition. Repetition, in this case, depended on more violence occurring. Prevention and prosecution existed in an easy conflict. Another missed opportunity sits within early public communication. Warnings issued to the community were vague by necessity, but vagueness diluted their utility. Without features to recognize, people could not avoid the threat effectively. Without precision, fear diffused rather than focused. Some might argue that more explicit warnings could have led to greater caution or identification. Others argue they would have intensified panic and stigma without preventing harm. Both interpretations remain plausible and irreconcilable. The sketch itself represents another complicated absence. Composite art relies on memory, which trauma distorts. Investigators knew this. They also knew sketches could generate false positives or narrow focus prematurely. Still, the sketch was one of the few tangible anchors the case possessed. Yet it existed mostly within law enforcement rather than saturating public awareness. This reduced the risk of misidentification, but it also reduced the chance of recognition. Modern observers often ask whether the suspect was known privately and left unchallenged. There is no evidence to support or refute this conclusively. What is clear is that suspicion alone cannot substitute for proof. Acting without legal grounding risks injustice equally severe. Investigators chose restraint over risk, knowing that premature arrest could destroy credibility and collapse cases permanently. What was also missed is perhaps less tangible but equally significant: institutional empathy structured into process. Systems at the time were not built to accommodate survivors whose safety was threatened by participation. The expectation was conformity to procedure, not adaptation of procedure to vulnerability. Trauma-informed approaches were not standard. Silence was interpreted as reluctance rather than risk management. In this context, the Doodler case becomes a study in structural insufficiency rather than investigative failure. Just as systems function within ethical and legal limits, but those limits can become barriers when harms operate outside normative assumptions. When victims cannot testify safely, truth becomes conditional. Silence also masked scale. Investigators could never be certain how many attacks truly occurred. Survivors may have avoided hospitals. Assaults may have been reframed as accidents. Deaths may have gone unconnected. Each unreported incident reduced pattern clarity. What appeared limited may have been broader. What appeared to stop may have continued unseen. Segment 6 forces a reconsideration of what accountability means in such cases. Responsibility does not always correspond to punishment. Sometimes it manifests as acknowledgement of constraint. The failure was not in effort, but in capacity. This case teaches quietly but persistently. When justice requires exposure, those already exposed to harm will hesitate. Systems must change not only after crimes, but in anticipation of vulnerability. Without that adaptation, silence remains rational, and perpetrators benefit by default. As years passed, what was missed hardened into permanence. Not because no one cared, but because caring was not enough to overcome structural reality. The Doodler case did not collapse. It crystallized, an enduring example of how violence can persist not through chaos, but through order that does not bend. And perhaps the most difficult truth remains this: even if every correct decision was made with the information and tools available at the time, the outcome might not have changed. Knowing this does not absolve failure. It redefines it. Failure here belongs not to individuals, but to the limits of an era. The sketch remains. The silence remains. And the distance between them marks what was missed not by neglect, but by design. Time does not solve cases like the Doodler Murders. It does not deliver revelations quietly in the dark, nor does it organize truth into coherence merely by passing. Instead, time rearranges responsibility. What once belonged to investigators becomes memory's burden. What once depended on urgency becomes dependent on ethics. And what once demanded answers becomes a question of how to remember what never resolved. The Doodler case exists today not as an active threat, but as an unresolved record. Its violence has ended, but its implications continue. This transformation is subtle yet consequential. When a case stops generating new harm, attention tends to shift from prevention to reflection. Yet reflection without reckoning risks erasure. The question, then, is not whether the case can still be solved, but whether it can still teach. Memory is not neutral. What societies remember determines what they prepare for. In the case of the Doodler Murders, memory has remained uneven. For decades, the story lived primarily in police archives and community recollection rather than in mainstream historical narrative. Its victims did not occupy the central imagination in the way other crime stories did. Their absence was quiet then, and it remains quiet now. Ethically, this silence poses uncomfortable questions. Whose suffering becomes part of public memory, and whose remains compartmentalized as unfortunate footnotes? The Doodler's victims were men living at the margins of acceptance during a period when exposure itself was dangerous. Their anonymity was both shield and sentence, protecting them from immediate backlash while removing their stories from lasting recognition. Modern true crime culture often emphasizes resolution, arrests, confessions, DNA breakthroughs. The Doodler case resists that structure entirely. It offers no final scene where justice asserts itself definitively. Instead, it leaves behind an ethical tension: how to acknowledge harm when accountability cannot be obtained without demanding sacrifices from those already harmed. Those still unheard voices define the case more than any surviving record: survivors who never testified, witnesses who withdrew to protect livelihoods and lives, victims whose names were known but rarely spoken aloud. Their silence was not apathy, it was strategy. Survival demanded it. This reframing matters because it challenges the way justice systems are evaluated. Success cannot be measured solely by convictions when conditions make conviction inaccessible. Ethics require asking whether processes themselves were capable of protecting those they needed most. In the Doodler case, the answer remains ambiguous at best. Over time, cultural shifts have altered these calculations. Legal protections expanded, visibility increased, trauma-informed practices emerged, but these developments arrived too late for this case. Retrospective improvement does not retroactively resolve harm. It only contextualizes it. The Doodler remains unnamed publicly, not as an act of mercy, but as a result of absence. Without testimony willing to survive cross-examination, names remain speculative. Accusations remain withheld. This restraint, frustrating as it feels, reflects ethical discipline rather than neglect. Naming without proof risks injustice of its own. Still, restraint has consequences. Silence protects process, but it also preserves ambiguity. The result is a story without closure, burdened by questions that cannot be answered fully without violating the same ethical principles. Meant to protect victims, as memory takes over from investigation, responsibility shifts again. Now it belongs to those who tell the story. How it is framed matters. Sensationalism would distort reality. Myth would undermine truth. What remains is documentation, careful, restrained, and respectful. Segment 7 does not seek resolution. It seeks acknowledgement that silence can be rational, that fear can be structural, that justice systems built around visibility inevitably fail those for whom visibility is dangerous. The enduring lesson of the Doodler Murders is not about criminal ingenuity or investigative weakness. It is about incompatibility, when the cost of speaking exceeds the promise of safety. Silence becomes ethical, and when silence prevails, accountability dissolves. San Francisco today is not the San Francisco of the 1970s. The city has changed, openly embracing identities once forced underground, yet the case remains anchored to its era. It cannot be relocated into modern frameworks without distortion. It belongs to a moment when freedom and fear coexisted uncomfortably. As this story concludes, the city returns to dusk, streets glow softly, conversations drift without urgency, and beneath contemporary normalcy lies a memory that resists finality, a series of lives interrupted, a series of voices withheld not by choice, but by necessity. The Doodler case does not ask for myth, it asks for remembrance, quiet, accurate, and complete within its limits. And in that remembrance, the still unheard voices remain, not absent, not forgotten, but held carefully within the silence that once protected them.